Below is the full draft of Chapters 1, The Immovable Monuments and Writing of Ancient Egyptian Africans, 2, Critique of Movable Evidence, 3, The Rosetta Stone and European Appropriation, 4, The Transformation of African Writing into Western Alphabets, 5, Constantine and the Codification of Empire, 6, Biblical Literary Invasion and Appropriation, 7, Rome, Literacy, and Control of Knowledge, 8, Museums, Archaeology, and Manufactured Authenticity, 9, Writing as Colonization, 10, Returning to the Source, Africa as the First Word, The African Origins of Writing and Civilization, Unmasking the Deception of Transportable Evidence. Chapter 1, The Undeniable Monument, Egypt as the Immovable Record. When human history speaks of greatness, it must bow before what stands unshaken, the Great Pyramids of Giza. Long before the names Mesopotamia, Greece, or Rome entered human memory, the African builders of the Nile had already carved a civilization into the face of eternity. These ancient Egyptian Africans, the architects of proportion, mathematics, and cosmic order, left behind not fragments, but monuments, not tablets that could be carried away, but truths that could not be moved. The pyramid as written knowledge. The pyramids are not mute. Every stone is a glyph, every line of symmetry a verse in the language of the cosmos. To the ancient Egyptian Africans, architecture was not separate from writing. It was writing. Geometry was their alphabet, balance their grammar, and proportion their syntax. Hieroglyphs, carved on the walls of temples and tombs, were extensions of this same principle, symbols encoding the logic of life, nature, and divinity. Unlike the brittle relics unearthed in foreign lands, Egyptian hieroglyphs are carved into immovable walls of granite and limestone. They cannot be forged, transported, or reconstructed in warehouses. They exist where they were meant to exist, in the sacred geography of Africa. Writing as an act of permanence. In the Nile Valley, writing was a sacred science. The scribes were not mere record keepers. They were the interpreters of divine intelligence. Writing was an act of creation, a continuation of the same principle that brought the universe into being. To speak a thing was to make it exist. Thus, the word was sacred because it mirrored divine order, or ma'at. This connection between writing, architecture, and the cosmos demonstrates that ancient Egyptian Africans viewed knowledge not as information to be stored, but as energy to be lived. Their monuments were both text and testimony, material and metaphysical. Immovable truth versus portable interpretation. The pyramids stand as history's first library, written in stone. They cannot be packed into crates, smuggled into foreign museums, or rewritten through translation. Their authenticity is unchallenged because their presence is physical, immovable, and aligned with astronomical precision. By contrast, the archaeological record of other ancient civilizations depends largely on transportable evidence. Clay tablets, seals, or inscribed bones, all of which can be removed from their context and reinterpreted elsewhere. Egypt's testimony, however, is unmovable and self-contained. The monuments themselves resist distortion, not because of their size alone, but because their knowledge was fused with the land and the sky. Civilization as a written landscape. When one stands before the Great Pyramid, one stands before a text written not in ink but in mathematics. Every cubit and proportion corresponds to cosmic law, to the sun's path, the earth's tilt, the calendar of time. Writing in this sense was not the invention of Marx. It was the art of expressing divine order through form. The ancient Egyptian Africans thus created the world's first living script, where knowledge was both read and inhabited. The pyramids are not the symbols of a vanished age. They are the evidence of the African origin of civilization itself. They remain the most irrefutable record of intellect, discipline, and mastery humanity has ever known. Chapter 2, The Fallacy of Movable Evidence. If the pyramid is immovable truth, then clay and bone are portable interpretations. Throughout modern archaeology, claims of early writing in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and ancient China rely on fragments that can be carried, traded, or displayed. These items, tablets, seals, oracle bones, serve as the Western foundation for the history of writing. Yet, because they are transportable, their authenticity can never rival the immovable testimony of Africa, the museum problem. From the 18th century onward, European powers built empires not only through conquest of land, but through the conquest of memory. Artifacts removed from their original sites became evidence to support a rewritten world chronology that placed Africa at the margins. Transportable artifacts, clay tablets, seals, and shards could be moved, cataloged, and reinterpreted to fit this Eurocentric sequence of civilization. Unlike the Great Pyramid or the temples of Luxor, these fragments depend on institutional authority for their credibility. Their truth exists only as long as the museum says it does. The ancient Egyptian Africans did not need museums to prove their existence. Their civilization was self-evident. The land itself, its monuments, its inscriptions, its astronomical alignment, bears witness without intermediaries. Forgery and context. In scholarly terms, authenticity is proven by context, yet transportable evidence by its very nature is easily separated from context. A tablet can be moved, a seal can be replicated, and inscriptions can be discovered wherever authority demands. Even when excavated under supervision, their interpretation remains pliable, dependent on the language, ideology, and cultural lens of those who claim to decode them. The sheer volume of such discoveries does not confirm truth. Quantity is not authenticity. If every piece can be removed, then every piece can be forged, and the interpretation itself becomes a form of authorship, a rewriting of history through control of the narrative. Authenticity versus possession. The Western tradition equates possession with proof. The fact that a museum holds an artifact is treated as evidence of its legitimacy. But possession is not truth. The African tradition holds that knowledge is true only when it remains in harmony with the land, the people, and the cosmic order that gave rise to it. The monuments of ancient Egyptian Africans cannot be possessed, and that is precisely why they remain true. They cannot be relocated, edited, or retranslated. Their authenticity is self-contained. Their existence is their own witness. Civilization without intermediaries. When evidence must be interpreted, translated, or decoded through another culture's lens, authenticity fades. Egypt's evidence requires no translator. Its architecture, mathematics, and symbols speak for themselves. The pyramid does not depend on Western interpretation to prove its genius. The world itself measures time by its alignment. In this light, all movable artifacts claiming to represent the first writing pale in significance. Civilization's origin cannot be carried in a box. It stands immovable under the African sun, written in stone, awaiting only the world's willingness to read it truthfully. Chapter 3, The Rosetta Stone, Decoding Africa, Rewriting Europe. Recap: Foundations of African Immovable Truth. Before we journey into the story of the Rosetta Stone, let us remember the immovable truth laid by the ancient Egyptian Africans. In chapters 1 and 2, we explored the Great Pyramids, those monumental texts in stone, each block a letter, each alignment a verse in the cosmic language of the Nile. Hieroglyphs were more than symbols. They were living knowledge, inscribed where they belonged, in the land itself. We also saw how movable evidence, clay tablets, seals, and inscribed bones, cannot compete with this immovable record. These artifacts, no matter their number, are always susceptible to removal, reinterpretation, and even forgery. The pyramids, the temples, the tombs, they exist in place as enduring witnesses to the intellect of the ancient Egyptian Africans. With that foundation, we turn to the Rosetta Stone, an artifact celebrated in the West as a key to Egyptian writing, but whose story tells us as much about European ambition as it does about African genius. Discovery and seizure. The Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799 near the town of Rashid, or Rosetta, in the Nile Delta during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. A slab of granodiorite inscribed in 3 scripts: hieroglyphs, Demotic, and Greek. It immediately captured European attention. Scholars hailed it as a key to understanding ancient Egypt. But this is where the narrative begins to twist. The stone was removed from Egypt by the British, who took it to the British Museum, where it remains today. Napoleon's campaign itself was less about learning than it was about control, military, economic, and intellectual. Europe had begun the long process of extracting African knowledge and claiming authority over its interpretation. Decipherment through a European lens. Champollion, Young, and other European scholars approached the Rosetta Stone not as an African text to be understood on its own terms, but as a puzzle to be solved using Greek as the reference point. Hieroglyphs, once living symbols connected to African cosmology, became phonetic equivalents, stripped of their spiritual and symbolic depth. What the ancient Egyptian Africans had embedded in stone, their theology, cosmology, and understanding of the universe, was reduced to an alphabet, a code, a linguistic artifact to be cataloged and tamed. The Rosetta Stone became a tool of translation, yes, but also a tool of redefinition. African writing, once self-interpreting and inseparable from its cultural context, was now subject to European control. Colonial implications. The seizure and interpretation of the Rosetta Stone marked a turning point. Africa's intellectual heritage was suddenly being mediated by institutions thousands of miles away. Museums became authorities, and interpretation became power. The Rosetta Stone exemplifies a pattern repeated across the continent. Immovable African genius, pyramids, temples, tombs, is contextualized, filtered, and repurposed to fit a narrative of Western discovery and supremacy. Here, European scholarship does not merely observe, it appropriates. What the ancient Egyptian Africans wrote in their own language, in their own sacred spaces, becomes property of the collector, the linguist, and the museum. The Rosetta Stone as symbol, not solution. It is tempting to view the Rosetta Stone as the Rosetta of civilization, a miraculous key. Yet its true significance lies in what it reveals about Europe's relationship to African knowledge. The stone itself is not knowledge. It is a mirror reflecting the ambitions of those who controlled its interpretation. The ancient Egyptian Africans did not need a Greek translation to validate their hieroglyphs. Their writing, their monuments, and their knowledge were complete and self-evident. The West only required the Rosetta Stone to create a bridge to African wisdom, a bridge it would claim as its own. Chapter 4. The Theft of Language. From African symbols to European alphabets. From sacred symbols to abstract letters. With the Rosetta Stone, we see the beginnings of a pattern. African writing is observed, abstracted, simplified, and claimed. The transition from hieroglyphs to European alphabets illustrates this vividly. Ancient Egyptian Africans wrote in symbols that were simultaneously visual, spiritual, and performative. Each glyph contained layers of meaning, connecting the human to the divine, the temporal to the eternal. In contrast, the Phoenician alphabet, later adopted and adapted by Greeks and Romans, reduced writing to a system of consonants and vowels. Functional, yes, but stripped of spiritual and symbolic depth. Europeans inherited a world of African intellect and recast it into letters, laws, and administrative tools. The living, breathing system of knowledge was transformed into bureaucracy. Rome, Constantine, and the rewriting of knowledge. The Roman Empire, and later Constantine's Christianization of Europe, played a decisive role in codifying this abstraction. Under Constantine, Africa's intellectual and spiritual traditions were appropriated and repurposed for empire. The donation of Constantine, a later forgery, symbolized this perfectly. The European Church claimed authority over lands, people, and even ideas, all while erasing their African origins. Writing became a tool of governance, law, and religion, a shadow of what it had been in African hands. The sacred inscriptions of the Nile, once immovable and self-authenticating, were now translated into European alphabets, recorded in codices, and used to propagate ideologies foreign to the civilizations that created them. Language as colonization. Every step in the evolution of European alphabets and script is, in essence, a step away from African truth. The simplification of African symbols into letters served the practical purposes of empire: standardization, control, and codification. Literacy became an instrument not for liberation, but for administration, a tool to manage populations rather than to transmit African wisdom. Movable artifacts, tablets, and inscriptions, easily replicated, sold, or removed, facilitated this process. The West did not merely borrow African knowledge, it dislocated it, abstracted it, and claimed it as its own. The enduring legacy. Yet, despite these efforts, the African origin of writing cannot be erased. The pyramids, the temples, the hieroglyphs, all immovable, all authentic, continue to speak. Even the Rosetta Stone, though exploited and interpreted by Europe, remains a link back to the original source. European alphabets, codices, and institutions are built on foundations laid by ancient Egyptian Africans. Every discovery that Europe claims is a reframing of what Africa had already created. writing as a tool for governance, expression, and cosmic understanding. Conclusion: reclaiming the narrative. The story of the Rosetta Stone and the theft of African symbols into European alphabets is not simply about artifacts or alphabets. It is about power, interpretation, and the control of history. The ancient Egyptian Africans wrote in a world where meaning was sacred, embedded in the land, and inseparable from culture. Europe sought to extract, translate, and claim that knowledge, abstracting it for empire and ideology. To understand writing in human history, we must read Africa first. The pyramids, the temples, the hieroglyphs, immovable, self-authenticating, undeniable, tell the true story. All else, if movable, must be questioned for authenticity. The narrative of civilization begins in Africa, not in Greece, Rome, or Europe. Chapter 5: Constantine and the Rewriting of the World. The Rise of Constantine. The year was 312 CE. The Roman Empire, sprawling across continents, stood at a crossroads. Power was no longer merely political. It had become intellectual, religious, and literary. Enter Constantine the Great, an emperor whose vision reshaped the world and the very way humans understood authority. Constantine did more than rule. He rewrote the narrative of civilization. His embrace of Christianity transformed not only religion, but literacy, language, and knowledge itself. Writing, once a reflection of human and divine consciousness, as the ancient Egyptian Africans had practiced, was now a tool of empire, codifying laws, dictating orthodoxy, and controlling memory. Empire and the codification of knowledge. Before Constantine, African civilizations, particularly in the Nile Valley, had embedded knowledge into the landscape. Hieroglyphs, pyramids, and temples acted as living texts, immovable, self-authenticating, and directly connected to cosmic order. Under Constantine, writing became portable, centralized, and uniform, designed for administration and compliance. Documents like imperial edicts, codices, and the eventual canon of Christian scripture were not written to reflect universal truths or cosmic order. They were written to consolidate power. Writing moved from sacred permanence to human authority. Perhaps no single document better illustrates this shift than the donation of Constantine. This forged text, later exposed by European scholars, claimed that Constantine had granted the Pope control over Rome and the Western Empire. Its existence reveals the early strategy. History and knowledge could be fabricated to legitimize authority. The parallels are clear. Just as movable artifacts could be misrepresented or reinterpreted, so could writing and history. African civilizations had created immovable, self-authenticating knowledge. Rome and the Church created texts that derived power not from truth, but from who claimed to interpret them. Christianity as a tool of rewriting. Christianity under Constantine became the vehicle for reordering the world's intellectual and spiritual map. The African origins of philosophy, cosmology, ethics, and writing were gradually appropriated and reframed. African wisdom was absorbed, abstracted, and deployed to serve imperial and religious agendas. The shift was subtle but profound. Knowledge that had once been inseparable from the land, the people, and sacred practice was now codified into texts. The living, immovable intelligence of African civilizations became a foundation for a religion and empire that claimed universality while erasing its source. Empire-controlled literacy. Constantine's model of literacy was not liberating. It was prescriptive. Writing became a weapon, a means of regulating thought, faith, and behavior. The portable texts of the Church, the codices, and the legal documents all illustrate a fundamental departure from African principles of immovable, context-rich knowledge. In this moment, the world transitioned from writing as sacred and embedded to writing as centralized and controllable. African truth became the substratum upon which Rome and the Church built their authority, and history itself began to be mediated by those in power. Chapter 6: The Biblical Literary Invasion. The myth of Israel in Egypt. With the foundation of empire and empire-controlled literacy established, the stage was set for the literary invasion. One of the most enduring narratives to emerge was the story of Israel in Egypt. Western history and religion claim that Jews or Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt, a narrative central to biblical theology. Yet evidence from ancient Egyptian African records, monumental architecture, and hieroglyphic inscriptions tells a different story. There is no trace of mass Hebrew occupation or enslavement. The biblical story, repeated over centuries, appropriates African cosmology and history, transforming it into a moral and spiritual fable designed to serve later empires and ecclesiastical structures. Appropriation of African philosophy and ethics. Biblical texts are not created in a vacuum. They borrow heavily from African intellectual traditions. The ethical maxims, moral laws, and spiritual narratives of ancient Egyptian Africans, once inscribed on temple walls, tombs, and monuments, were absorbed and reinterpreted. Consider the maxims of Totep or the Book of the Dead. These texts reflect principles of justice, balance, and cosmic order, Ma'at. Yet in the biblical canon, similar themes are transformed into moral commandments, laws of sin, and salvation narratives. African wisdom, rooted in the land and cosmic understanding, became abstracted into literary forms for Western spiritual and political use. Christianity and Judaism as literary constructs. Both Christianity and Judaism, as codified in the texts of the Church and later religious scholarship, rely heavily on these appropriated African principles. The narrative of salvation, the laws, and even historical claims are all constructed within a framework that obscures the African source. The Promised Land, the Exodus, and divine law are not neutral historical truths. They are literary and theological devices that repackage African intellectual and spiritual achievements into tools of ideological control. Transformation of African wisdom into Western moral texts. The process is subtle yet enduring. African knowledge, once immovable, contextual, and spiritually embedded, is transformed into portable texts that can be read, interpreted, and disseminated at will. The Western literary and religious tradition thrives on mobility. Codices, scrolls, and printed texts carry the authority, while the original African context is largely erased. Movable texts are prized because they are controllable. The immovable, self-authenticating monuments of Africa, pyramids, temples, inscriptions, cannot be moved, and therefore cannot be fully claimed. The West, therefore, depends on portability to assert ownership over knowledge and history. The enduring impact of literary appropriation. The literary invasion of African wisdom has left a lasting legacy. Western institutions, religions, and histories continue to interpret the past through a lens that separates African intellect from its origin. Biblical narratives, codified laws, and the canon of Western moral texts all carry echoes of ancient Egyptian African thought. Yet the source remains uncredited and often unrecognized. Despite this, the immovable monuments, the hieroglyphs, and the enduring structures of the Nile Valley bear witness. They remain the ultimate counter-narrative. They prove that writing, ethics, law, and cosmology were conceived, inscribed, and lived in Africa long before Europe claimed to discover them. Conclusion: reclaiming African authorship. The work of Constantine and the literary invasions of Christianity and Judaism demonstrate the subtle but systematic reappropriation of African knowledge. Movable texts, codices, and translations became instruments of control, while immovable African knowledge remained self-authenticating. To understand the origins of civilization, writing, and ethical thought, one must read Africa first. Only by acknowledging the ancient Egyptian Africans as the foundation of intellectual history can we reclaim a narrative long obscured by empire, translation, and portable authority. Chapter 7: Rome, Literacy, and the Control of Knowledge. The Empire of Letters. Rome was not just an empire of armies and roads. It was an empire of letters. Writing became the instrument through which control extended beyond the battlefield, reaching into every corner of conquered lands. Latin, codified and standardized, was more than a language. It was a mechanism of domination. The ancient Egyptian Africans had understood that writing was a sacred act, inseparable from place, ritual, and cosmic law. In contrast, Rome abstracted writing, turning it into a portable tool of governance. It was no longer a reflection of lived knowledge. It became a device to categorize, command, and regulate. Education as control. Education in Rome was limited and selective, designed to create an elite, literate class loyal to imperial authority. Knowledge was no longer a universal heritage, but a privilege and a responsibility. Libraries and schools were established not to preserve African wisdom, but to transmit a Roman worldview that prioritized order, administration, and loyalty to the state. African centers of learning, including the libraries of Alexandria and Carthage, faced systematic suppression. Texts were destroyed, relocated, or ignored. The erasure of African scholarship allowed Rome to monopolize knowledge, presenting itself as the inheritor of civilization, while conveniently omitting the true African origins of much of that knowledge. Portable knowledge, centralized power. The Roman approach to writing emphasized mobility. Scrolls, codices, and inscriptions could be copied, transported, and interpreted anywhere in the empire. Control over these texts meant control over what could be known and believed. Knowledge became centralized and codified, divorced from the context in which it was originally produced. Here, the contrast with Africa is striking. Immovable inscriptions, hieroglyphs carved in temples and tombs, could not be taken, altered, or abstracted. They resisted control and demanded interpretation within their own spatial and cultural reality. Roman literacy, by contrast, functioned to extract, standardize, and impose meaning across vast territories. The power of historical narrative. Through literacy, Rome controlled not only law and governance, but history itself. The power to write was the power to define the past. African contributions were marginalized or reframed, while Roman achievements were celebrated as the peak of civilization. This pattern would continue under later European empires, reinforcing the misrepresentation of African intellectual heritage. In essence, Rome transformed writing into a tool of empire. African knowledge, once embedded in stone, ritual, and landscape, became abstracted, portable, and manipulable, a precedent that would shape the museum era, archaeology, and modern historical narratives. Chapter 8. Museums, Archaeology, and the Manufacture of Authenticity. The rise of museums. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European museums emerged as the primary custodians of human history, or so it was claimed. Objects from Africa, Egypt, and other lands were removed from their context, curated and displayed in glass cases and galleries. Museums became instruments of authority, deciding what was authentic, valuable, and universal. Movable artifacts, statues, tablets, jewelry, and inscriptions were prized because they could be transported and controlled. Immeasurable monuments like the pyramids or temples could not be relocated, and thus their authority remained African, unmediated. Museums, therefore, became spaces of intellectual colonization, presenting curated fragments of African civilization as evidence of Western discovery and scholarship. Archaeology and the extraction of history. Archaeology, while often portrayed as a scientific pursuit, became a vehicle for rewriting African history. Excavations were not neutral. They were guided by European questions, assumptions, and agendas. Artifacts were removed from their immovable context and interpreted through Western frameworks. The story told by movable objects was carefully constructed. Clay tablets, fragments, and inscriptions were extrapolated to create narratives that suited European chronology and ideology. Africa's own monuments, temples, pyramids, tombs, were often ignored or misrepresented because they resisted this manipulation. The illusion of authenticity. In museums, authenticity is not always inherent in the object. It is conferred by the curator, the institution, and the narrative that frames it. A stone tablet, once transported, gains authority not from its context or origin, but from its placement behind glass and its inclusion in catalogs. This is the opposite of African epistemology. The ancient Egyptian Africans did not require curation to prove their knowledge. Their writing, architecture, and monuments were self-authenticating, integrated with land, ritual, and cosmic order. The West, lacking immovable monuments of its own from these periods, relied on portable evidence and the authority of interpretation. Monuments versus artifacts. The contrast is clear. Immovable monuments, the pyramids, temples, and inscriptions, speak directly. They are living texts, resistant to reinterpretation, falsification, or relocation. Movable artifacts, by contrast, can be curated, misrepresented, or recontextualized to serve European narratives. Western scholarship often treats the sheer volume of these artifacts as proof of historical truth. Quantity, however, does not equal authenticity. Without context, without immovable verification, movable objects can be manipulated, their story rewritten, and their origin questioned. The museum as modern empire. In this way, museums operate as modern extensions of empire. They assert authority over the past by controlling objects, interpretation, and display. The African contribution to civilization, architecture, writing, and science, is filtered through this institutional lens, often distorted or minimized. Yet the monuments remain. The pyramids still rise in the desert, unmovable, self-authenticating, and undeniable. The temples still bear hieroglyphs carved by the hands of ancient Egyptian Africans. The immovable truth persists, even as portable objects are curated to tell another story. Conclusion. Reading Africa first. To understand history, one must read Africa first. Museums and archaeology, as practiced in the West, offer fragments, curated interpretations, and portable evidence, not the full, immovable truth. The pyramids, temples, and inscriptions of the Nile remain the ultimate authority, resisting manipulation and affirming African authorship of civilization. The lesson is clear. Authenticity is not in the number of artifacts, but in their immovability and context. Africa's monuments speak for themselves. They demand to be understood on their own terms. And only by reading them first can the world begin to reclaim the history that has long been obscured, appropriated, and rewritten. Chapter 9. Writing as colonization. The weaponization of words. Writing is power. But when removed from its original context, it becomes a tool of domination. The history of writing, especially in relation to Africa, demonstrates this clearly. The ancient Egyptian Africans inscribed knowledge into stone, architecture, and ritual, creating systems of communication inseparable from the land, culture, and cosmos. Europeans, arriving centuries later, turned writing into a weapon. Letters, codices, and scrolls were abstracted, moved, and interpreted to control not just information, but people. Literacy became a mechanism of governance. Education was no longer a conduit for understanding the universe. It was a conduit for obedience. Portability and appropriation. Movable texts allowed empires to claim ownership over knowledge. African wisdom, encoded in pyramids, temples, and hieroglyphs, was abstracted into codices, translated, and sometimes even forged to fit European ideologies. The Rosetta Stone, the codification of biblical texts, and the creation of European alphabets all illustrate this process. The mobility of these texts contrasted sharply with African immovable monuments. The West needed transportable evidence to assert authority. By controlling interpretation and access, Europe effectively colonized African writing and, by extension, African intellectual history. Religion, literacy, and imperial control. Christianity, Judaism, and later Western institutions used writing as a means to consolidate power. The biblical narrative, codices, and European educational systems all relied on the abstraction of African wisdom. Knowledge that had once been sacred, contextual, and immovable was now portable, interpreted through foreign lenses, and deployed for governance, moral authority, and social control. Writing became less about truth and more about legitimacy. The colonization of African intellectual heritage was not simply physical or military. It was literary, symbolic, and epistemic. Enduring impact. The colonization of writing has left a deep imprint. Modern education, historical scholarship, and even popular culture often present African civilization as derivative, secondary, or discovered by Europe. This is the legacy of movable texts interpreted outside of their original context, yet the immovable evidence remains. The pyramids, temples, and hieroglyphs of ancient Egyptian Africans continue to testify to the truth. Writing as colonization is powerful, but immovable African knowledge is indestructible. Chapter 10. Returning to the source, Africa as the first word in. Reclaiming authorship. If writing was taken, abstracted, and repurposed, then the task of our time is to reclaim its source. Africa is the first word, the first sentence, and the first story of civilization. The ancient Egyptian Africans wrote knowledge into the landscape, into temples, and into cosmic alignment. Their monuments are living texts, speaking across millennia. To understand human history, one must read Africa first. The pyramids, the Great Sphinx, the temples of Luxor, and the hieroglyphs are not optional references. They are primary sources. They are self-authenticating and immovable. They demand recognition and respect. Immovable evidence as truth. The immovable evidence of Africa cannot be stolen, altered, or reinterpreted. Unlike codices or tablets, these monuments resist manipulation. Their placement, design, and inscriptions are deliberate, precise, and cosmic in scope. They encode mathematics, astronomy, theology, and governance. In this sense, Africa's monuments are not just historical records, they are living knowledge systems. They predate Rome, Greece, and all later European civilizations, and they remain unassailable in their authenticity. Philosophy, spirituality, and African knowledge. Reading Africa First is not merely an academic exercise, it is philosophical and spiritual. African knowledge was always holistic, combining science, morality, spirituality, and governance. Hieroglyphs were not just marks on stone, they were living symbols of the universe, of human potential, and of cosmic law. To ignore this is to accept a fragmented understanding of history. To read Africa First is to reorient the world toward truth, understanding, and respect for its intellectual origins. Correcting historical narratives. Modern scholarship, media, and education have a responsibility. African history must be presented not as derivative, but as foundational. Movable artifacts, when removed from context, cannot tell the whole story. Immovable evidence, pyramids, temples, inscriptions, must form the backbone of historical understanding. The process of reclamation is ongoing. It involves critically examining Western narratives, questioning the authority of museums and codices, and embracing African-authored sources as primary evidence. It is a philosophical, cultural, and historical imperative. Africa as the first word. The story of writing, civilization, and knowledge begins in Africa. The first words were not codices or portable tablets. They were carved into stone, built into monuments, and aligned with the stars. To reclaim African authorship is to acknowledge that civilization itself was written first on African soil by African hands. Africa is the first word. All later words, European alphabets, codices, religious texts, and scholarly interpretations, are responses, interpretations, and sometimes misappropriations of that original utterance. To read the world honestly, we must read Africa first. The immovable monuments of the Nile are the ultimate witnesses, the first texts, and the first truth.